Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Saturday, 23rd September. It will be slightly cloudy with highs of 14 degrees Celsius or 57 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:39 a.m. and sunset at 6:49 p.m. We are on the 54th day of the Warsaw Uprising and there are continuous bombings happening and even more atrocities, aren't there?
Yes, there are, but I want to start with talking about Jerzy Zborowski. He's an insurgent that obviously fought in the Warsaw Uprising. He was born in 1922 in Warsaw, and he had to finish his high school education in secret, as we very well know. During the occupation, schools were closed, so you weren't allowed to continue your education, so you had to do it in secret. And then he moved on in 1941 to a school of machine design, and he continued that throughout the occupation. Now, he's been in the underground resistance since 1940, so he's been there for quite a while now. And he was introduced into a youth organisation that more or less evolved into the small sabotage organisation, the Wawer unit, which we've spoken about before. Now, he took part in a lot of actions. I'm only going to mention a couple here because we could be here otherwise all day. So in May of 1942, he took part in a very interesting action, actually. It's called the Megaphone Action, and he's one of the people that initiated this action. So there are a large group of megaphones that are installed by the Germans where they would broadcast war propaganda announcements and various different orders and things like that every day. Now, what those young boys did was they took various different types of switches and they organised a studio in one of their apartments and they broadcast a short speech to the Poles in Polish, some Polish military marches, and they were all broadcast in the Żoliborz district in Wilson Square up in the northern part. So the local people there just were incredibly happy. They were joyful. They gathered, and of course this was not very well received by the Germans and it caused a bit of problems. But in late 1942 this becomes a full-blown assault platoon or an assault group, and he becomes one of the team commanders there within the Żoliborz district. Now, again, on the 2nd of February of 1943, he participates in the removal of sensitive materials from the house of Jan Błoński from his apartment. Just to let you know a little bit about who Jan Błoński is, 'cause I'm not going to mention a name and not tell you who he was. In the basement of his building, he set up a chemical factory and a warehouse where they stored sabotage materials. So basically the things that he would produce were things like tear gas that they would go and drop in cinemas, in theatres, in places where they knew that the Germans would be. So they were small acts of sabotage that they participated in. And he was arrested with his parents and his sister in this apartment in November of 1942, so literally a few months earlier. He was imprisoned in Pawiak and they found materials in his apartment but not the secret laboratory that he'd set up in the basement. He underwent an incredibly cruel investigation at the Gestapo headquarters. He didn't betray anybody and he was more or less tortured to death, and he died in an isolation cell in February of 1943. And his parents, who were also imprisoned in Pawiak prison, they were shot. His father in February and his mother later in May, and his sister was then deported to Majdanek concentration camp, but she's the only one out of the four that survived. On March the 26th, he takes part in Action Arsenal, so the very famous one where they managed to free Jan Bytnar, or Rudy, which is his codename, a very famous action that every Polish child has read the book on this, Stones Against the Rampant. I'll start another podcast, I'll tell you all about the action. Absolutely incredible. He participates in liberating prisoners. He participates in the liquidation of Franz Bruckel. He was an officer at Pawiak prison and he was incredibly cruel. He'd hang prisoners, shoot them, torture them, set his German shepherd on them, and they managed to liquidate him. He took part in lectures. So for example, he was the lecturer. He also helped teach at the infantry cadet school. Obviously everything was done in secret. And then he fights in the Warsaw Uprising. Now, before I move on to what he did in the Warsaw Uprising, I want to talk about Janina Trojanowska. I think you all might know where I'm heading with this story. She was the daughter of Brigadier General Mieczysław Ryś-Trojanowski. Just a side note, he was murdered in Martenhausen a month before it was liberated in 1945. She served as a messenger for the deputy commander of the Parasol Battalion, which oddly enough was Jerzy Zborowski. That's another thing I forgot to mention. He was also a deputy commander of the newly formed Parasol Battalion during the occupation. She was responsible for being the liaison between other units and him. She organised classes where they were supposed to be, what they were supposed to be on, schooling the people who were in this unit. She participated herself in these courses, and she graduated in May of 1944 with very, very good results. I mean, being the daughter of a general, she had to join, same as my grandfather, son of a general, had to join into the resistance. It's been written in the stars. And then she fought in the Warsaw Uprising as the messenger to Jerzy Zborowski. So on the 8th of August, on the 8th day of the Warsaw Uprising, she was wounded in the defence of the cemeteries in Wola. She was hit in the jaw, and as some insurgents remember, she was disfigured. And her first words apparently were, when she was in hospital, was, "Jeremy, you will not marry me." So here is the biggest hint of all. Her and Jerzy were in love. On the 17th of August in the Old Town, Janina and Jerzy get married in the church on Długa Street. And then they go into battle as a married couple. After the Old Town falls in the first days of September, Janina and Jerzy together move with the units to Czerniaków district, and that's where they join in the defence. Jerzy, he more or less followed the same battle she did. So from Wola to Old Town, Czerniaków, he commanded his battalion from the 6th of August. And after they got married, he continued. Now, he'd been wounded 3 times. And on the night of the 22nd and 23rd of September, he's captured by the Germans together with Janina and other insurgents that were wounded from various different groupings in the basement of a house in Wilanowska Street. Because he was so seriously wounded, he had to be carried on a stretcher by 3 other wounded insurgents to Aleja Szucha, to the Gestapo command on Aleja Szucha. That's the place that he was most likely shot together with all the wounded insurgents, his wife Janina, because she didn't want to leave her husband. And their bodies have never been found, and neither have the other insurgents that just disappeared. There is a bit of debate amongst insurgents where they were last seen, but we're going to stick to this generally, that they were seen last on Aleja Szucha. But their bodies have never been found, and 2 of their symbolic graves are at the Powązki Military Cemetery. They're not together, but they're still there. In Mokotów, there's still artillery fire and air bombing continuously happening, and on the night of September the 22nd and 23rd, the Germans are also heavily attacking the Żoliborz district, but the insurgents are holding their ground and they're managing to repel these attacks. Antoni Chruściel puts out a situation report where he says the district has established contact with the Soviet army. Communication takes place via radio. Upon request, the Soviet army supports our troops with artillery fire, and our observers direct the fire and the road to the crossing at Powązkowa Street. 3 cannons and 1 mortar. So in a way, the Soviets are helping, but are they helping enough? The insurgents are being given help, marginally. The insurgents fighting the Germans means the Germans are more occupied with the insurgents in Warsaw rather than targeting their firepower and military strength. They're the Soviets who are still sitting on the other side of the river Vistula and more or less watching Warsaw burn. In Śródmieście, the insurgents that are still sitting in Czerniaków are taking a daring action to try and break through to southern Śródmieście. Even before reaching their designated area, they face enemy resistance. This is where the group ends up splitting. Some return down to the river Vistula and some end up surrendering. Claire, this is more or less the fall of Czerniaków today, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very grim. After the capture of Czerniaków, the German troops shoot or hang around 200 insurgents, messengers and medics. These are largely the wounded ones among them. And that includes at least 1 Catholic chaplain. And I think it would be useful to just stop and think a little bit about faith in the uprising. Of course, there were people from many different faiths and none who served, Poles, including a number of former concentration camp inmates, Jewish concentration camp inmates who had been liberated when their small camp inside Warsaw was taken early on. And those that are able, join the fight. And of course, they come from many different nations. But the majority of the insurgents are Polish Catholics. And their chaplains, they remain on duty throughout the uprising, right to the very end. And they continue their services, their ministration. So you find, we've talked a bit about the wedding ceremonies. There were so many wedding ceremonies, and they are, of course, conducted by chaplains. The antipathy of that is, of course, they are also conducting a number of funeral services. But they also hold regular masses throughout the uprising. And Zoe is among many who really takes this to heart and finds real strength in going to those services. Many of these chaplains, they also felt it was their duty or their role to remind the combatants that human dignity put them under an obligation towards their fellow fighters and even towards the enemy. So you get a lot of accounts of the wounded Germans also being treated in the hospital, sometimes moved towards the front as the Germans begin to encroach, which is, of course, a way of saying, look, we are humanitarians. We have shared humanity. This is how we are treating your people. Treat us with that same dignity. And some of the support for that came from the ministrations of the priesthood. But they're just trying to continue to organise the ongoing religious life of the civil population as well, both within Warsaw during the uprising, but also as they are expelled and sent out towards that transit camp at Pruszków. And one of these chaplains is Father Józef Stanek. His codename was Rudy. He was a chaplain of the Krishka group, and he was among those hanged after the capture of Czerniaków. During the uprising, Father Stanek had performed mass, he'd taken confession, he'd been on duty visiting people in hospitals, giving the last rites, rescuing the wounded himself actually from the front line sometimes and bringing them back to the hospitals. And in the days before his murder, Father Stanek he'd had the chance to evacuate himself to the other side of the River Wisła, but he had given up his place to a wounded soldier so that he could stay behind and continue to help. So he was captured by the Germans. I'm afraid to say he was tortured, and then he was hanged with his chaplain's stole. That's the coloured or the dark, often dark scarf that a chaplain will wear on their white robes, which has their badge of ordination on it. So they used that to hang him around the back of a building, around the back of the area they'd just taken. I mean, I think it is beholden on us to remember these individual stories, but also to put them in the context of what the diversity of people who were serving in the uprising, and many of them were actually chaplains just trying to keep on their usual ministrations as far as possible.
Claire, do you find that some of these stories seem to repeat themselves? I'm not saying that the witnesses are falsifying their memories or anything, but a lot of these incidents seem to happen over and over and over. So, for example, the priest that was just hanged by his scarf, this is also the same story that we hear during the Wola massacre, where in the Wolski hospital, the chaplain is also hanged by his scarf in his office. It's just this repetitive motion, I think, of these stories constantly repeating themselves over and over and over with just different players.
It's partly just reminds us as well of the statistics of the size of this event. I think it's really important to drill down and tell the individual stories, but it is equally important to remember the numbers of people involved. So the civilian casualties, we're now talking hundreds of thousands. Eventually 200,000 civilians are estimated to have died. We'll never know the exact figures. Around 16,000 insurgents. The number of weddings that take place, just the numbers of people involved in this. This is not a minor engagement. This is the largest organised act of defiance against Nazi Germany during the Second World War, statistically. So yes, there are repeated horrors. There are repeated moments of celebration, of humour, of communities coming together to provide strength through masses, through weddings, through songs, going out. You get these occasions of people round. It's almost like a campfire, but it's not. It's a burning city, but people bringing out what instruments they have, and young people going off and falling in love. You get all of life going on because this is a major, major event. And while it's important to remember the individuals, it is important to remember also there are trends, there are patterns you can see when you're looking at an engagement on this scale. And one of those patterns, unfortunately, is the deep inhumanity as policy of the German forces. Roger, you have been looking at what's been going on in Moscow and the Soviet policy. Can you tell us some of the trends and some of the specifics of what's happening today?
Yeah, there's some interesting sort of developments. As we mentioned yesterday, this report on a conversation with Foreign Minister Molotov about the utility of political and material utility of airdrops to the insurgents in Warsaw, and the Soviet view on that. There's another sort of development in, if you like, the propaganda war on the 23rd of September. This comes from a conversation in the Kremlin between Stalin and the American ambassador, Avril Harriman. Harriman, of course, was one of the, relatively few, I think, senior personnel on the Allied side that sort of would, often cast a rather sceptical eye towards the Soviets. I think this was certainly in the run-up to Yalta and ultimately Potsdam. There's a lot of rather sort of rose-tinted attitudes, I think, on the part, particularly of people like Roosevelt and Churchill, towards the Soviets and towards Stalin himself. Harriman didn't really share that. He was actually quite sort of sober in his assessment of the Soviets. But interestingly, he reported a conversation with Stalin in which Stalin claimed that the Home Army commander in Warsaw, so Borko-Moravsky, could not be found. He was no longer in Warsaw, which was not true, but he said that it should be assumed that he's left the city and commands via a radio station in an unknown place. Now, this is kind of, you could say this is almost like an echo of, Stalin's own predicament in the summer of 1941, with the Germans, closing fast on Moscow, and there's mass evacuations of infrastructure and of the organizations of government and everything else. But Stalin crucially stayed in post, and it was one of the reasons really that Moscow held. And it's a bright point in his career as a war leader that he was brave enough to stay and to realize the significance of his possible departure from an embattled Moscow in 41. So you can see him casting shade. Now, it might be that he received that intelligence that Borko-Moravsky had left Warsaw. We don't know. But it could also be that he's sort of casting shade very knowingly on the cause of the insurgents and on Borko-Moravsky by extension, by saying that they've left the city. So it's quite an interesting development there.
I just going to jump in and say Avril Harriman hasn't always got that form of being entirely cynical or critical. I mean, obviously, we know Harriman starts off, he is the American ambassador to Britain, then he becomes the American ambassador to Soviet Russia, and he is there. It's on his watch that we have Katyn and the investigation and the journalists that go in to investigate Katyn independently to see, because the Germans claim it was a Russian crime, and of course the Soviets claim it was a German crime. Among the journalists go in is Harriman's own daughter, Kathleen, and the report comes back and it states that this is a German crime. Well, it's a Soviet crime. We know that. I think it was pretty clear then, and we certainly know it now. So Harriman, nevertheless, that's the report that gets sent back to Washington. So he actually does have some form of, well, perhaps he is swallowing the propaganda from Stalin, or perhaps he is making a more strategic decision that actually we need to continue working with Stalin right now. And the same is true at this point as well. We need them on the Eastern Front. Of course, the Allies need them. So perhaps he's making a strategic decision. You can't actually read his motives into this, but I think we do have to sort of treat it with some caution.
No, agreed. I think in that case of Katyn and his daughter's involvement, I think it's very difficult. I think we talked about this before. It's very difficult for her to see perhaps clearly what was being presented, because they presented all of that information. It was very emotive, it was very immediate, it was very visceral, and to actually remain objective in that environment must have been extremely difficult when everything you're being shown is, so that, I think in a sense to sort of criticize her for going with that narrative, I think it's a little bit unfair, but yeah, no, I take your point.
No, I do agree. I'm just trying to shine the light on Avril more here and just being a little bit more skeptical about what his, because as you say, this is such an interesting report.
There's another interesting one here from a representative of the government in exile, and this is a former district delegate. So they had, if you bear in mind, you have to remember that the Polish underground had, rather like the 1863 rising, previous rising against Russian rule, they had positions and infrastructure sort of, governmental infrastructure sort of built in as part of the rising, as they had the fundamentals of a government in place. And the representative in Lvov, his name was Ostrowski, and now he'd been arrested by the NKVD and released, and he later wrote a letter to the Lublin Committee, so this communist government in waiting, if you like, in Lublin. And he wrote a letter to them in which he says that, the events of the recent days, and he says, where the blood of Home Army soldiers is mixed with the blood of the People's Army fighters, he says, fills me with encouragement that the moment is near when all Poles who today still distrust each other, sometimes even enemies, will be united by the effort to build a common home for a free, democratic and independent Poland. It's a very nice sort of pious hope on behalf of Mr. Ostrowski, but as we've seen in the dealings of the Soviets with their Home Army, shall we say, opponents, that's a rather misguided hope, I would suggest. Rather, I could even say, I think, naive. But, nonetheless, you can see there are some still who are hoping for some collaboration with the Soviets.
Thank you so much for listening to us on day 54. We will see you tomorrow for day 55. And please remember, if you like us, rate us on your favourite listening platform. And we will see you tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone.